Hey everyone, welcome back. We have Attorney Vera Zambrano back with us today, and we're doing part three of our criminal justice series, where we are discussing and juxtaposing the American criminal justice system, right, with the European criminal justice system. Um, Today's podcast is going to be a little bit different. We're going to be kind of getting into more just the nitty gritty of the American criminal justice system. But it's my pleasure to have Attorney Vera Zambrano once back with us. Thank you, attorney, for being with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Ramon.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you that have not seen the first couple episodes, right, I'd like to go ahead and just tell you a little bit about who she is. So she's a practicing attorney here in the US, in Miami, but she is also an attorney in Germany. And she's a member of the German American Lawyers Association, and she is also a member of the International Bar Association. So Attorney Vera Zambrano, what you're in Miami? What's the weather like? I'm just to get us started. What's the weather like over there in Miami right now?
We have great weather again. So last week was pretty bad, right? The flooding was very bad actually. But now it's very sunny again, tropical weather, very warm. So yes, everything looks fine. How about Utah?
It's beautiful out here. We had this week was kind of unique. We had one day of the week that it only happens like once every few years, where it's super cloudy, like it's like dust in the air, very windy. Like I'm talking about like 80-mile-an-hour winds, 60-mile-an-hour winds. And I'm just estimating, right? It was we had one of those days earlier this week, but now it's just absolutely beautiful. It's nice and cool, about 70 degrees, 75 degrees. So
Nice.
yeah.
It's very nice.
And
Yeah.
then Vera, I know and I think it'd be something cool for our listeners to know. So you're expecting twins, right?
Yes, correct.
How
Currently
did
6 months right now. And yes, like it hasn't changed anything regarding my work schedule, right? Like 7 days a week. But it's sometimes, you have to adjust a little bit. Also, like, when you're just burned out, or when you just work too much, you just need a little rest, right? On the weekend or in the evening. So, that comes on top of it, but it doesn't stop anything for my life.
Yeah, that's awesome. Congratulations. I mean, that's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do you know if you're having boys or a boy and a girl or do you know?
Yes, so we were gonna have a boy and a girl, actually. So a little couple, so that's pretty awesome.
That
Um,
is.
so I wanted always boy twins. Like it was just something I talked about and like joking, right? And then it actually happens. So, but now we have boy and girl. Yes, and very excited, but I still have a little bit of time, like three and a half more months to go.
Yeah, yeah. And you were telling me that you said that now they're at the point where you can feel them moving around quite a bit and
Yes, exactly. So now they're very active whenever we see them, ultrasound. They're flipping around, they're very active. They kick each other, right? They kick each other already. And, the girl is super quiet. The boy is very active. So I think that might be a little, signal for me what to expect with a wild boy. But at this point, it's still very nice, right? It's not like too uncomfortable. It's very nice still.
awesome, awesome. Cool. So we're gonna go ahead and jump into this. I'd like to go ahead and just for our viewers, I'd like to let them know kind of just some bullet points of some of the stuff we'll be discussing, just so that they can follow along and they have an idea, right, of what we're discussing. So number one, we're gonna talk about the importance of understanding the legal procedures and kind of your legal rights. Number two, we're gonna talk about the structure of the legal system, right, at the state and the federal level, just very superficially. We'll go into some of the general differences, right, between civil procedure and criminal procedure. And then we'll talk about, I think this is going to be very valuable for people, talk about kind of the step-by-step process of what to expect if you've ever had a loved one or, get charged with, some criminal charges. Because a lot of times if somebody's never been through that process, they have no idea what to expect. And we'll talk about kind of what the process, the steps are. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about the rules of evidence. We won't be able to dive super deep into that because the rules of evidence alone is super complex, and that alone could be hours and hours worth of conversation. But I think what we can, we'll talk about it, just overall, generally get into some, maybe into the nitty gritty of some of the rules, And but yeah, I'm looking forward to this. It's going to be an exciting conversation. So yeah, so Vera, if you could maybe lead us off, can we talk a little bit about, and I know every state's a little bit different, but maybe we can start off with Miami, right? That's where you're from. If we can start off there and just talk a little bit about, you know, kind of the court system. How is the court system set up? You know, and by that I mean, you know, like just the different levels, right? The different courts that are there.
Yes. So when we talk about, state court, federal courts, we have to first look at, the overview in the US, right? So for the listeners, for the viewers, it might be very important to understand that in the United States, there's a dual court system, right? So we have state courts and federal courts, and they have very different responsibilities. They are handled separately, right? So you can see there are parallel tracks. They have like very similar systems in place, but they actually handle very different cases in detail, right? So the lowest courts where you start, the entry level, are the trial courts, right? Or in the US, in the federal level, it's a district court, right? We have the appellate courts, right? It's the first courts to appeal. And the highest court is the Supreme Court, where you rarely end up with your case, right? Only a very, very few percentage of cases will ever become a federal court case in the Supreme Court or in the state court even. So it's very important to know this, difference. And a court's authority to hear cases and make a legal decision, you have to understand the jurisdiction, right? It's not only about the local courts, about the geographic scope, but it's also about whether it is a federal or a state question at hand. So you end up before a federal court when there is a breach of federal law in the US, right? Only if there's a breach of the federal law case. So when we talk about the federal breach, it's about, violation of the Constitution, for example, right? Federal questions of national interest. Also, all the cases where it's above, I believe, $75,000 US, right?
Yep.
It's also responsibility of the federal court. There, in contrast, we have the state courts. They are known as the general jurisdiction, and meaning they can raise, any claim under state or federal law, except those who are only the exclusive jurisdiction under federal courts. So that's just in a nutshell, right? Like federal courts and state courts. So the three levels are the same, right? The court system itself starts with the trial court, right? A district court, then the appellate, and then the highest court is the Supreme Court in both cases.
Yeah. So just to recap, so they have the same structure, they just have different names, right? Because at the state level, you have trial courts, appellate courts, right? So like the Miami Court of Appeals, the Utah Court of Appeals, and then you have the Supreme Court. Do you know if every state has a Supreme Court?
So a state Supreme Court, yes. But it's like only the very least cases, I believe. So from around 7,000 cases a year, the Supreme Court only takes on around 70 to 80 cases, right? So because the Supreme Court decides if they're gonna decide on a case or not. It's very different from the appellate court, right? It's a court of appeal that has to take on this case. When you appeal against a court decision, they have to take on your case and decide over it again. But the Supreme Court, they might make the decision if they are willing to take on the case and decide on it. They will check if it's of national interest, if there is, if the importance is high enough, right, for the case to make a decision. And if there's already a similar decision in another case, right, they can also recheck and say there's no need for us to actually make a new decision in that particular case.
Sure. And just conceptually for our listeners and viewers, so the trial court, right? You have your trial. If a mistake gets made or you feel like your rights were violated, the whole purpose, right, in theory, is for the Court of Appeals to review those mistakes, those errors, and then rule on them, either overturn your case or affirm it. And then if you feel like the Court of Appeals made a mistake, in applying the law, right? Or precedents or rules or whatever, and you believe that they made a mistake in reviewing the lower court, then that's when you petition to the Supreme Court of that state. And in
Yes.
Utah, and in Utah, they call it a petition for cert or a petition for certiorari. And like you said, it's like less than 1% of the cases get accepted for review.
Yes.
Not that you'll win, but that they'll actually give it a deeper look.
Yes, exactly. So when we look at, the state court level, right, it mirrors a lot the federal court system, as I said, right, because they have all the three tracks are the same, right, and they're generally composed to those levels, like an entry level as the trial courts. Then we have the appellate courts and the state Supreme Court, right? State Supreme Court is a different Supreme Court than the federal court, Supreme Court, which a lot of people mix up or they think it's the same, right? But it's different, the state Supreme Court. And yes, as I said, you have to petition, right, to the US Supreme Court, to the state Supreme Court in this case. And they were willing to decide if they're going to take on the case and make a new decision in your case. So a lot of states, like in Florida and Utah as well, we have probate courts, right, that are only specified on administrative matters. And they are very different from the neighbor states. Yeah. So probate courts is what we see in a lot of inheritance matters also, right? So it always depends on what is the matter of the case, and where is it geographically located, right? Yes.
Yeah, and then also, right, there's also, they call these, I don't know if you have them in Florida, but in Utah, they have these things called justice courts, which is like for smaller things, smaller matters, for different, little infractions and different things like that. And
yes.
And I guess if we're gonna, try to squeeze it into one of our three categories, those would be still at the trial court level.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but it's different types, right? They specialize in kind of like probate court, they specialize in a certain type of case, and just courts. Yeah. So, and then for the federal courts, same concept, different structure, right? You have the trial court, instead of a trial court, federal district court, like you said, and then you have your circuit courts, which, like in Utah, and by the way, for those that are listening that don't understand this whole concept of a circuit court, I believe, and please correct me if I'm mistaken, but every circuit court, and there's I think 11 of them, each one oversees like 4 or 5 states, right? Like so. In Utah, like it's the 10th Circuit, and it's like there's 5 states that are under the 10th Circuit, and those are the 10th Circuit is almost like a court of appeals on the federal level, right?
Yes, yes. If I'm not mistaken, we have 13 circuit courts in the country, in the whole country. And we have 94, I believe, district courts. So in the whole country, right, on federal level. On only, of course, only one Supreme Court, federal Supreme Court. So it's a lot. It's really a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, and then for those people that, because I've met so many people that wanted to, their desire was, right, like in Utah, there's a lot of things that, anomalies, we'll say, right, the way that things are done, and people have this dream of being able to take it to the U.S. Supreme Court, but I think a lot of people don't understand what you said, which is that the U.S. Supreme Court probably takes significantly less than 1% of the cases, right? At the state level, maybe it's 0.5% to 1%, but at the U.S. Supreme Court level, it's probably like 1% of 1%.
Yes.
So
Yes.
It's super difficult to get those, that court, the highest court in the land, to get them to actually look at an issue, irrespective of how good you think it is.
Yes, yes. So that's also like it tells people also that only the cases that end up there, they are either of national importance, right? Or they are important regarding the Constitution of the United States, right? Or it has not been decided yet, and it's like a new development in a society that has to be determined by the court. I remember that one of the last ones in the Supreme Court, on a federal level, was about the abortion, right? The discussion about the abortion, how long should women be allowed to abort, right? And are they making the decisions themselves, and what happens and the consequences, right? So there was like a national importance for the federal level, and also constitutional question, right? So those kind of cases that could end up, right? But as you said, less than 1% of all the cases that are, that are submitted to the Supreme Court, they get decided, right? And they take a look at only like a very small percentage.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what I'd like to do, Vera, is I'd like to just kind of, because this could, this could be a very extensive subject, but just generally, I'd like to be able to just talk about kind of the differences between the civil procedure, right? Just generally, and the criminal procedure with regard to two specific things. Like I said, this could be a huge subject, but with regard to rules, right? Because they have different rules, and maybe you could speak to that a little bit, and also to the burden of proof, for both different types of procedures.
Yes. So one of the fundamental, most radical differences between civil law and criminal law, because people believe criminal law has to be something with a crime, civil is something between people. That is only partially true, right? Because a criminal case is always the state against a certain person, right? So it's a public interest, if you will, in those cases. A civil law case is always between parties, individuals, or also companies. When companies are, having a dispute over something, right? That's civil law. It's not any that even if something happened, of criminal intent, or fraud or whatever, right? It's still within the civil law case that has to be decided in a civil court. So there are a lot of different rules also between civil and criminal cases. When you look at the system itself, everyone that is accused in a criminal case is presumed to be innocent, right? Until they are proven guilty. So that's in the law, right? So that means the prosecutor, the state attorney's office, they have to prove that someone is guilty, right? Beyond a reasonable doubt. So the defendant practically, if the attorney decides to do so, they wouldn't have to say one single word, right, throughout the whole trial. They can remain silent. It should not and cannot hurt their case, right? So because the state has to prove that the crime has been committed, right? In civil cases, it's always a plaintiff and a defendant, right? So the plaintiff who goes to court, who wants to sue someone, they have to prove what the case is, right? And that they are, they have the right to do so. And the standard of the proof is lower, much lower than in a criminal case. They just have to, it's called the preponderance of the evidence, right? So they only have to prove that it's more likely than not that something happened the way they present it.
Yes. So this is yeah, I agree with what you're saying. In theory, that's all correct. And then we're gonna go ahead and just add a little controversy here.
Yes.
So you're talking about the burden of proof, right? In the criminal justice system, how the burden of proof is on the state. And you also mentioned that the person is presumed innocent until proven guilty. Would you agree or disagree with the fact that in our society today, there are a lot of situations where that's not the case, where the person, and not, right, the letter of the law doesn't change, that's still the same, and everything, the jury instructions are still the same, but would you agree that there are a number of types of situations or cases where it's actually, and it could be for any number of reasons, whether they're high profile cases or because of the types of charges, where an individual is actually treated as though they're guilty until proven innocent by both the criminal justice system and potentially even the jury. But I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yes. Yes, you're very right when you say that's a theory, right? It looks good on paper. It should be, like that should be the standard, right? But I've seen a couple of cases, like I would not say like the majority of cases, but still a lot of cases that especially when there are jurors, when there's a jury, like a small or a grand jury in place, when you have actually not that kind of standard, right? The objective that you have to prove someone is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, that like it leads to the fact when you have a grand jury, you have more of, it's more, I wouldn't say entertainment, but it's more, you have to present a lot of different evidence, but also you play with emotions of the jurors, right? So jurors can and probably are easier manipulative, right, than a lawyer is, right? Because we face that every day. We have those cases every day, right? We're believing facts when we see them, right? We're not easily manipulative. But jurors might come across being a duty, right? This is a duty only 1 or 2 times in their lifetime, right? So they might be excited by the fact that they are a juror. They have to decide on someone's guilt or innocence, right? And it's always dangerous for a suspect or for a defendant when there's a prosecutor or when there's someone from the state attorney's office that is very good in convincing people, right? It's not only about the facts, it's also about emotions. Can you put fear in someone's mind, right? Can you portray the defendant as someone who he's not, right? Then sometimes they put the actual crime or the crime they want to portray as the defendant's whole life, right? This one single act is not a person's whole life. So sometimes the jury might think like, okay, this person was portrayed as such a person, the whole past, right, was read to them, right? And they did not even take into consideration that this was a single day. A crime does not happen a crime has to always be determined by a very specific time and date. So a crime can only be happening in one day at a certain time and minute of the day, right? So when we look at that, that's a lot of jurors actually in real life, they are led a little bit into behind the light when they are seeing those presentations from the state attorney that is painting a very bad picture of someone they don't even know, right? The state attorney doesn't know the defendant before he got arrested, right? And the jurors don't know the defendant, right? Or they cannot know the defendant, otherwise they will be biased. So it's obviously the crime itself sometimes is pushed, right, to be bigger than what has to be presented in court, because the jury should only consider what is presented in court. All the evidence that is presented, and what cannot be presented should not play any role, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting, right? To go back to the original question, there are situations, and we all see this, right, where like there's so much publicity that's that's targeted towards vilifying a certain person, right, that's been charged with whatever crime. So like in the public eye, right, based on all the propaganda, like that person walks in and they're essentially guilty at that point. But then there's two additional thoughts that come up, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. And one of them is that you said that the person doesn't even have to testify, right? That they actually don't even have to present a defense because the burden of proof is on the prosecution. But I'd love to know from you if you think that's actually, like, in practicality, if that actually is the way that it's just an opinion, right? There's no way to really scientifically know that's allowed by law, right? You have to actually what is it called? We actually interview each of the jurors, but I'm just wondering if that's the case, because I got a feeling that if somebody does not testify, that naturally the jurors are going to assume that that person might be guilty, and it's exacerbated, particularly when the prosecution, which they're not supposed to, but the prosecution sometimes will make the argument in closing arguments, right, that the defendant didn't defend himself, that he didn't, right, speak for himself, and so that's exacerbated by that. And then, but also, well, let's start with that so we don't complicate matters. What are your thoughts on that right there?
Yes. So you're right, like on paper, right? Regarding the law, it's everyone's right to remain silent, especially if you have a defense attorney or a private attorney even, right? Because that person has to take care of your best interest. That person, you hired that person to represent you, right? Because this is an expert in the law. So the best thing you could do, right, is not to talk, actually. Only in very rare occasions when the defense attorney like asks you to please, make a statement to, for various reasons, to like to portray yourself or tell the jurors about, your past life. But it's like, I only recommend that in a very rare cases for the client to actually, speak up and testify, because It is, as you say, it is about, evidence. Can the evidence be proven or not? If someone makes a statement, it could be beneficial, but in a lot of cases, it might be not beneficial, right, for the defendant. And jurors, they, the problem is they are not legal experts, right? They cannot have any background in law. So that is why it's so complicated to tell them, to try to make them understand that they should not draw any consequences out of someone's right to remain silent. It's a constitutional right, right? It's in the law. So it's for your best interest to not say anything, because the state has to prove that you committed a crime. And you should never say, okay, that is, a signal for me that why does this person not testify or not speak up, right? That has to mean something. No, it does not, right? So like a person who is not, familiar with those terms, it might say, okay, there has to be a reason why this person doesn't want to say something. But that's, usually the task of the prosecutor should be, because they have to be objective as well, right? They have to present also beneficial facts, beneficial evidence, and also facts against the suspect. But in a lot of cases, what happens, they only present negative facts, right? So they would have to tell the jurors in the first place, only what you hear in this courtroom is based is a baseline for your decision, right? And you cannot, just because someone doesn't want to speak, or someone is advised not to speak because of the attorney they choose, right? They think something else is going on. So that should be a little bit more, the jurors should be more informed before the trial starts, right? That this is their right regarding the law, and it means nothing. Like in any legal case, it means nothing, right? That's a problem in the practice, in reality, yes.
It is. I've actually, excuse me, have met people that decided not to testify.
Yes.
And the evidence was weak. And objectively, you could say that the prosecution did not meet their burden of proof, but still, that person was convicted. I mean, I've met a number of people like that personally. Here's another interesting thing too, and we don't have to get too deep into this, but I'd love to be able to mention it, because there's all these little nuances, and it's funny because the more you talk, the more like you trigger all these questions, and we'll never end on this one subject if I keep asking every single question. But one thing I'd like to point out that I think is interesting is that we talk about how somebody is innocent until proven guilty, but you have a bail that's set by the judge, and generally speaking, these bail amounts are, like, we understand it in American society, the vast majority of people, whether you're talking about like middle class or lower class people, right? That's the bulk of everybody, right? Not the very wealthy or the upper middle class or the upper class, right? That makes, 300,000-400,000 a year, right? But just the average person, they live, generally speaking, paycheck to paycheck. They don't have savings. Studies on this. There's tons of studies on this stuff. They do not have $10,000 in cash sitting around. They don't have $50,000 in cash sitting around. They set these bail amounts at 50, 100,000, 200,000. I mean, like it's almost like there's this concept in the law, right? They talk about legal fiction, right? Like and you've probably heard that. It's like this that it's like this rule or theory or concept or principle, but in reality, it's not true. Like, so when you and the way I'm connecting that to what we're talking about right now is this. I'm saying if the average person gets charged, and we assume, let's just assume they're innocent, and they get set with a bail amount of $50,000, right? Which, I mean, at least here in Utah, those are common. Like, most felonies will have, and it's so easy that almost everything's a felony. It seems like, so $50,000. But in reality, what percentage of average people have $50,000 in cash sitting around?
Yes.
And of course, you could say, well, they can go to a bail bonds company, 10%. Well, what percentage of people have $5,000 in cash sitting around? Most people don't. They've done studies on this. They said that most people, the average American, right, is two paychecks away from being homeless. So if we know that there are 2 paychecks from being homeless, then that means that they definitely do not have $5,000 sitting around in cash. So if you're charging people, and we're presuming that they're innocent, and then you're setting bail amounts, right? I don't know what the average bail amount is, but if we're using this example of 50,000, you've essentially already convicted that person, because now you just put them in jail. they can't bail out, they're losing their job, they're losing their house, their reputation is ruined, their family life is destroyed, everything starts collapsing, everything around them, everything their entire life that they worked for collapses, one thing after another, because the average person cannot afford to pay 50,000 or 5,000, much less $50,000 to bail out. So I think that's ironic, right? Like we talk about innocent until proven guilty, but just by setting such a high bail amount, already you've convicted them in a sense, right? Because now they're, if you're innocent, you would think, bro, there's no consequence, there's no punishment. But what I just described to you, there's some massive consequences that cannot be undone, right? If your house goes into foreclosure, even if you get proven innocent a year later, guess what? You've already lost your house. You've already lost your job.
Yeah, for a lot of people, it is actually not possible, right? Not even to collect the money from, family members, because also the standard of living in the US compared to, for example, Germany or other European countries is much higher, right?
Mhm.
When I look at, Florida, for example, or other states, the services are much higher, right? Are more cost intense. Like a lot of, health insurance, like only the example of health insurance, it's so much more costly than in Germany, right? Where everyone, even if you're unemployed, you have a health coverage, right? And people don't understand that the standard of living is so different. In other countries, it might be possible, right? Because people have savings, they can if save up. A lot of clients here, they have, like multiple kids. They already have 2-3 jobs, right? But they can still not save money, right? So especially when it comes to the criminal court system, a lot of people cannot pay the bail, right? And they cannot bail out. So they sit in jail until the court trial begins.
Yeah.